Hello, hello. Thank you everyone for joining us today in our webinar where we are going to be talking about who we hire is who we become, rebuilding the police talent pipeline. Thank you so much for joining. We're really glad to have you. Before we get started, a couple of logistics to cover. If you have any questions, you'll notice there's a panel when you joined. It's our GoToWebinar chat panel. Feel free to drop any questions that you have there and we will either answer them directly or at the end we will answer everyone's questions aloud so everyone can hear the answers. The slides will be emailed out to you tomorrow, and if you have any questions after the webinar, please feel free to email us. All right, I am Alicia. I'm really here just to facilitate the mastermind of JT. I am the Director of Growth Marketing here at NEOGOV, and I'll go ahead and let JT introduce himself.
Hey, good morning. My name is JT Monoushagian. I'm a retired chief, retired at the end of January after 22 years of service and spent the last 6 years as chief.
Thank you. All right, here's just an overview of what we're going to address. We have 5 questions here that address how we're going to talk about rebuilding the police talent pipeline and how who we hire is who we become. So we'll dive right in here. So the first question, JT, that we've been talking about is, why does hiring determine culture? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, and for this, I wanted to start with a quote that used to be up in the Dallas Cowboys locker room, and my chief, when I got to Lake Worth, had it up on the wall in the PD, and that is, you get what you demand, you encourage what you tolerate. And so when you're looking at who you want to bring into the organization to serve the community, you have to consider what the community's expectations are. Every community is different. And one of the mistakes that we can make when we're trying to hire folks is hiring kind of a rubber stamped person, looking for something exact and then trying to copy it multiple times. The truth is that that just doesn't reflect our communities. They're made up of many different people from many different backgrounds. And so it's important that we approach hiring the same way and we consider a wide variety of people so that it properly reflects our community and that they can relate to our community.
Yeah, I love that. Can you talk to me about how you go about figuring out what it is that your community specifically is looking for?
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways that you can do that. And I'll say, if you're a new chief or a leader in a new role, a new command, what have you, being new is the perfect excuse to go out into the community and start asking questions. Say, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I'm new here, and I'm trying to figure out what you're looking for in your police department. We exist to serve you, so tell me a little bit about what you're looking for and what you want that to look like. For the chiefs or leaders who have been in roles for some time, it's not too late to start fresh. So you can hold a community meeting, you can post a survey on your department's social media. There's a number of ways, but the mission has to be derived directly from the community. And then we take that feedback and we turn it into our department's culture.
Yeah, that's great. When you and I were talking earlier, we were talking about an example of when you're bringing in lateral hires, like what could the community be looking for? Can you give us a couple of examples of how one person might be different from the other and how you can kind of align that with what the community is expecting?
Yes, when officers have experience, generally when they move to a new department, they bring their prior culture with them, their values, their beliefs. And sometimes that's compatible with a new community and sometimes it's not. And it's important that whether it's in our field training or our onboarding, that the new culture is established and it's made very clear. But we have to know what that culture is before we can ever teach somebody or pass it along to them. So knowing who we are, what we stand for, what the community expects is really important. But then being intentional with our staff whether they're brand new off the street, how are we teaching and impressing that culture on them? And then for folks who are coming from outside the organization, how are they able to leave what they have learned culturally behind from their prior department and embrace our mentality and our culture at this department?
Yeah, that's great. Next, I want to dive into a little bit of why we might want to reference research at a national level. Can you talk a little bit about why you've leaned on research as a guide?
What I love about research is it gives us a lot more perspective on issues than what we can see with our own two eyes. Specifically peer-reviewed research, which has gone through that rigorous review process. The beautiful thing about it is that it exists to examine just about every issue that's out there. And so we can look to research, whether it's in criminal justice and criminology or in other disciplines, as a roadmap for how we can go about solving our problems. One that I came upon recently was talking about the imagery that we use in our hiring and recruitment, and how certain images attract certain people. And it encouraged leaders to take a couple steps back and evaluate whether or not that person that is depicted in the research is actually who we want. Police service, public service is rooted in service, just that. And when the imagery reflects, aggressive, enforcement, which is it's definitely needed, but the truth is that that's not what we spend the majority of our time doing. And so making sure that, how we're representing ourselves is accurate, but we may not have that awareness on our own. But when we look to research, it can kind of help spark new ideas or see areas of weakness that, that we couldn't see otherwise. I think it also gives us a lot to think about when we're trying to sort through disqualifiers. It's no secret that things have changed a lot when it comes to hiring and recruiting. And so there's pressure to maybe re-examine permanent disqualifiers from the community. But then as police leaders, we often struggle with this concept of lowering standards. We don't want to lower standards at all because the community deserves the best of the best. But through research, we can consider other ideas and approaches to maybe some of those disqualifiers. Drug use, for example, do we look at recent drug use, or do we look at drug use as a whole? And if we look at it as a whole, it can be a sort of hindrance for people who have made mistakes early in life. So I wrote a white paper several years ago about hiring military veterans and how they were the ultimate asset. But I didn't know that until I dove into the research to explore, like, is it more of a risk to hire veterans, or is it a lower risk and a benefit to the community? And the research really provided a guide for me to do that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think on this slide here, one of the pieces of research we wanted to share was that exactly, that recruiting military veterans can be a real asset. I think the stat you shared with me is that they are 21 times less likely to have substantiated complaints and unprofessional behavior, which is quite a staggering statistic. And I think without the research, without diving in, that's something that maybe we could be missing when we're trying to find the right people, and like, what communities do we want to try and be hiring out of. Can you talk to me about the transparency piece about early automatic disqualifiers? Why is that important?
Yeah, I think we just have to be upfront with the community and applicants about what we're looking for. All too often we post a job and we get eager folks who apply, only to discover down the line that they're not qualified because of a criteria that we had that they were unaware of. So I think any kind of permanent disqualifier needs to be front and center. so that number one, the community understands what our standards are and what we're expecting out of applicants, but also for the applicants themselves. There's nothing more frustrating than moving through a process without an awareness of exactly what's expected of you. So just putting that up front and center, I think, can make a real difference in getting people in our organizations.
Yeah, that's great. On that topic, let's move to where we feel like the pipeline is breaking down. So as we're trying to recruit officers, where do we feel like we kind of have like a kink in the hose?
Yes, so I have this theory, I call it the perfection threshold. And I think our communities are made up of real people. And we're all flawed. And so we've got to move away from this idea of that all applicants need to be perfect. So we just need to be very clear about what we need, what we're looking for, what are the qualities and characteristics, and acknowledge that you don't need to be perfect, but you do need to be honest and truthful and real. And then we need to look at what's keeping people out of the profession. We did a great job of this years ago when we looked at beards and tattoos. For far too long, we excluded really great applicants because of those things. And it was only when we stepped back and re-examined those disqualifiers that we realized, man, there's some incredible talent here that we just haven't had access to. And all we had to do was look at our criteria. So that moved us in a really positive direction. The other thing is the process length. You know, the days of filling out paper and passing it between the applicant and the agency, we should be moving farther away from that. Technology has given us a tremendous opportunity to accelerate the hiring process, not to be hasty or to move unnecessarily fast, but just to be more efficient. And that's great for the department, it's great for communities, and it's a good experience for the applicant. And then one of the biggest breakdowns in this process are those first 5 years. Applicants, new officers are at the greatest risk of liability in their first 5 years. And so I think we really have to rally around them and be upfront about the challenges they're going to face and have a framework and leadership and supervision that's going to help guide them and keep them on the right path. And we can do that by being upfront with them when they come into our organizations. Like, not only are we going to be efficient, we want this process to be really great for you, but we're going to provide you with the support that you need to move through your career and be successful.
Right. Yeah, that's great. When you and I were talking about this, you were telling me a story about an applicant. Can you share that story with us?
Yeah, and I want to preface this by saying this is me. This was my mindset, and I'm certainly not going to imply that anybody else has to embrace this. But certainly, if it inspires you to reconsider your criteria, then that's wonderful. But I was contacted by a professor at one of our local universities about a student that was struggling to get hired. The student or the professor asked if I would be willing to meet with him and kind of talk him through the process and give him any pointers that I could. And so I did. And when the student came in, he looked sharp, fresh haircut, suit and tie. And we were this was a casual meeting as far as I was concerned. So I was really impressed with how he walked into the room. And I said, all right, if I'm going to help you, you've got to be honest with me and tell me, you know, what it is that this challenge is about. And he said, all right, I'm going to put it all on the line. He said, when I was home for spring break several years ago, I was with my cousin and he encouraged me to try LSD. And so I did. It was an awful experience. I knew that it was a mistake, and I said, I'm never going to do this again. And then like a year, maybe 6 months later, he went home again And the same cousin came to him and said something to the effect of, you know, it must have just been like a bad dose, like you just give it another shot. So he did. And he had the exact same experience. And he said, you know, this is awful. I'm never doing this again. Please, you know, don't bring this to me.
Yeah.
And then he went back to school, did great in school, graduated from a wonderful university, great degree. And when he was filling out the PHS for police departments, he was honest. They asked about drug use, he put it on there. And they were saying, not only are we not going to hire you, but you can never apply again. And this guy seemed to have it all the things that we were looking for. And he was honest about something that was really difficult.
Yeah.
I ended up giving him a chance. Later on down the line, he was an intern for us. We hired him. He went on to be the salutatorian of his police academy class and is doing great things in his career. And the only thing it took was reconsidering those permanent disqualifiers. Sure, he used bad judgment a couple of times. A lot of young people do. But you know, people who have made mistakes and learned from them, which that's most important. What did you learn from that mistake that you can bring and leverage in the job? Those are exactly the kind of people we need. We do not need perfect people. We need people who have made mistakes and who can relate to people who've made mistakes. That's what our communities are full of. So I would just encourage people, anyone listening that has any involvement in the hiring process, to think about those things that are excluding people and not lower standards, but just maybe consider a new perspective and really examine the why behind that criteria.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's see here. Speaking of some of the ways that people can kind of affect the hiring process, when we're talking about leadership, what is their role and what can they do differently to help rebuild this pipeline?
So leaders are in positions of power and influence. And if you're looking out over the landscape of law enforcement today and you don't like what you see and you want to be a change agent, you have the power to do that. And like I mentioned before, that perfection threshold, you know, leaders, I would really encourage them to tear that down. We're not looking for perfect people. We need people who have had experiences and like I mentioned, learn from them. Those are going to be the most effective. We also have to take a look at who it is that we're bringing in and make sure that they're compatible with our community. It's unfortunate when you see like a new police chief, for example, come into a community and they bring the mentality from their prior agency with them, and it just doesn't fit because every community is unique. And so adapting our hiring processes and the people, the ideal candidate profile that we're looking for to our community is going to be really important. Taking the time to get to know those applicants and seeing how they're going to be a good fit is obviously a power play that we need to be leveraging. And all of that tracks back to ultimately, what do we want a seasoned officer looking like in our community? And let's start with that image and then work backwards through the hiring process and structure it in a way that we can find the right people. And then, you know, this is the perfect time as we sit here on the edge of this hiring and recruitment struggle that we're all experiencing. There's no better time than to innovate and be creative and look for new, unique ways to fill the gaps in our agencies.
Yeah, that's great. There was an example you were sharing with me of in the NFL and trying to hire the right athlete. Can you share that example? Because I think it really hit the nail on the head.
So we've all seen these sports teams that have an absolute superstar and then they cut them or they trade them to another team, and everybody's like, why on earth did they do that? And then it seems like on ESPN a couple months later, we learned like that guy or gal was just corrosive in the locker room. Like they were even though they had tremendous talent, they were setting the place on fire, from behind the scenes. And the same is true with our organizations. Like, there are a lot of really talented people out there, but it's not about just finding someone who meets the criteria and fits the mold. As I've mentioned many times throughout the webinar, it's about finding the right people, putting the right butts in the right seats to do the job that is very unique to our community is so important.
Yeah, that's great. What would you say if someone is on this webinar and they, maybe they're not the chief of their organization and they're trying to find a way that they can influence, they can make an impact on this process now in their current role?
Yeah, so I hope that the person that would self-reflect and ask that question understands that regardless of their role in the organization, you have influence. Sure, you may not be the ultimate decision maker, but you can bring new ideas forward. And I would encourage that person to control what you can control. You may not be able to make the ultimate decision about who hired or who is not, but if you can influence who gets interviewed and who doesn't, then great. Use this mindset to influence that process. We all have a role to play. We all need to do the very best that we can in those roles. So don't be discouraged. And then also, don't be afraid to leverage the data, the information. I think that today's law enforcement leaders really appreciate that. And so we shouldn't lead with opinions. Opinions are the lowest form of thinking from a stoicism perspective. So really lean into that research and the data to say, hey, I think we need to change this process, and here's why. Like, here's the support that goes with that. It's not just my idea, but others are doing this too. And I think it would be worthwhile for us to consider.
Yeah, that's great. What if there is a specific candidate that they might need a waiver to be hired because of what the policy states? Can you talk about if the recruiter feels like this is a really great person for a culture fit, and I think this was just, one mistake in youth, how can someone justify or bring the case to their chief of why this is a good add to the team?
I always treat it like consent to search. Asking our officers, like, what can you do with consent? You can do anything as long as you have someone's permission. And the same is true with waivers. The chief, ultimately has the decision-making authority with who we're going to hire and who we're not. And I would encourage you to really take the time to understand that applicant's story and advocate for them. Spell out the reasons why you think they're a value add to the team. But most importantly, leverage the lessons learned from whatever the disqualifying mistake is. That's where their value add is to the organization, is not in their mistake, but it's in what they learned from it. So just taking the time to spell that out and articulate that so that decision makers can consider it in totality and not just a couple lines on a page.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, that is all of our material for today. Thank you so much, JT, for coming here and being on and helping us kind of think about how we can be rebuilding this pipeline. To answer the questions about the slides, yes, you will be getting the slides. And also at the end of the slides, there will be links to the research that JT was discussing. We have 4 different sources to kind of help you all get started in some of that research yourself of how we can build this pipeline and find the right people and get those right butts in the seats. So thank you so much for joining. If there aren't any more questions, we will wrap it up, and thanks so much, everyone. Looks like that's it. All right, everyone have a great day, and thanks so much again.